Hi, my name is Merikay Smith. I am the leader of the Earth Stewardship East group in Maryland, D.C., Virginia. We are a local group of LDS Earth Stewardship, and it is early March. I've just come in from working in the garden, a little worn out, and I thought, okay, this is a good way to rest. I'll tell other people about food gardening basics so you too can get out and have fun in the garden and be tired. Anyway, so this photo is a photo of our vegetable garden in mid-spring. Doesn't look like that right now. Right now we're just seeding the early spring plants. But let's talk about why we garden and some of the best ways to approach food gardening. So let's look at it from the perspective of our faith. It's interesting. I grew up with President Spencer W. Kimball leading the church as the prophet, and he very much was an advocate for people to garden in their own properties. He told us that we should grow berry bushes, grapevines, fruit trees. He said, plant them if your climate is right for the growth. Grow vegetables and eat them from your own yard. Even those residing in apartments or condominiums can generally grow a little food in pots or planters. Study the best method of providing your own foods. Make your garden neat and attractive as well as productive. Apostle Tom Perry has said, L. Tom Perry, there have been very few years in my life when I've not been responsible for a garden. Even now, as a city condominium dweller, I still plant and harvest a garden each year. Each spring, as I look over an insignificant small seed and place it in a well-prepared seedbed, I marvel at how much it will produce. Have your own experience in planting a garden, then make application in your own life of this great principle of the law of the harvest. And there's so much that when you're gardening that you learn that is related to gospel principles, and it certainly gives you a deeper understanding of many of the parables that are related to planting seeds, caring for plants, even composting, pruning. There are many scriptures where if you've not done this type of work, it's difficult to have the same understanding. And then more recently, Sharon Eubank, this past fall, in a forum sponsored by LDS Earth Stewardship, told us about her experience planting strawberries. She said she has a black thumb, but in spite of that, she and her neighbor built some raised beds and in them planted strawberries. She said, and I'm quoting now, that it's as if she had created the earth in 7 days when she saw the strawberries start to ripen. She said the garden became a sanctuary, quote, to feel how I relate to creation and our Creator in the smallest miracle of a strawberry. In fact, she said she wrote her last conference talk sitting near her little strawberry bed. So I hope you'll take some inspiration from that and be happily looking forward to having your own vegetable garden. So in our property, this area used to be lawn, and now it's a vegetable garden, so it's much more productive in terms of providing food. And there are other benefits to having a vegetable garden. Some of the reasons we grow food: homegrown food tastes much better, especially when you pick it and eat it fresh, than food you buy in a store. It's more nutritious when it's eaten fresh. You are in control, so you can organically grow the food. And then there are the physical and emotional benefits that come from doing the food gardening, as well as we've heard from our church leaders, that there can actually even be a spiritual benefit to it. And then it adds to our food security. I mean, most of us would have a difficult time providing for our families entirely from what we create ourselves, but it can augment our food supply. And then in addition, it helps protect the environment. It saves fossil fuels and reduces pollution, especially if you're taking an area that is currently in lawn and you're taking it out of lawn and putting it into food production. And then it's interesting too to note that the average breakfast, for example, the food in that breakfast has traveled on average in America around 2,000 miles before it reaches your table. So it's not just the fossil fuels used in the planting and growing of the food, but also the transportation of it. And gardens that replace lawn reduce air pollution, because it turns out lawnmowers are very high in putting out air pollution. And so those are just some of the benefits to growing your own food. And this photo is from the vegetable garden that was established in front of the White House, on the White House, in an area that had been lawn by the Obamas. So another advantage to growing your own food is it's a great way to connect to the next generation, either your own children or other children in your community or neighborhood. And it's a wonderful way to teach life principles and science and biology. A lot of wonderful things can be learned in the process of gardening. And the photo on top, I was pleased when our daughter lived in Salt Lake for a number of years in a rental property. She took the little side area that had formerly just been weedy, and a weedy area, and transplanted it with herbs and vegetables to make a little food garden for herself. Again, it doesn't take a lot of space to do this, and it can be very satisfying. So one of the first things when you're considering to do food gardening is to do an assessment of what your resources are, so that you start a project that's reasonable for you. And that varies for every individual. So you want to think about the space you have in which to garden, and that might be, a back patio or window box. The time you have and ability, you can grow your ability by learning. So it's fine if you have no experience at all, but you can, a good first start is this talk, and you can check out books from the library. You can go online. There's simply a massive amount of information. So having no experience is not an excuse for not gardening. Then it does take some money, but there are ways that you can do this less expensively by often you can obtain materials from other gardeners who may have a surplus, including potting soil, pots, seeds, plants even. And then another important thing is to start small and then grow year to year as your skills grow and your resources in terms of established planting areas. So rather than starting off with say a 50 by 50 foot garden, it might be more reasonable the first year to do something that might be, say, 10 feet by 10 feet. You can still grow quite a bit in that area, and it won't be an exhausting amount of labor. Another thing is you can look at places that you would not normally think of in terms of gardening space, as this photo shows, where they're using part of their front lawn. In fact, it looks like most of their front lawn. It's a mix of food plants and ornamental plants. Then in siding your garden, it's helpful to choose a spot that's, of course, has got as much sun as possible, that is relatively flat, and you have to balance your desires with the resources you have at hand. In our area, need to fence for deer and to keep out smaller animals like rabbits and woodchucks. You can also think outside the box and use containers or other flower beds in which to grow your vegetables. So it doesn't have to be a typical vegetable garden to create food. And in this photo, we'll go into a little bit more detail about the key elements that you must have, basically. You have to have access to water. In our area, often we have enough rainfall that once a garden is established, it doesn't require a lot of extra gardening. But in the first month or so, unless we have very regular rains, it's important to water when plants are either newly transplanted or just growing from seed. So having a hose that reaches your garden, that's important. You need full sun. So ideally, your garden will be have a south or southwest facing orientation. It will get more sun that way. You want to be aware, as I said earlier, about the slope. That is important too. If it's too much of a slope, you may have a problem with runoff, and so you might need to terrace your garden. You need to think in terms of what tree roots might be present. You don't want both, because you don't want to damage your tree. So you wouldn't want to be digging in or putting too much additional material on top, like soil, on top of that area. So it's probably, if it's an area that's very densely tree rooted, you might need to think of doing your planting as another location. And of course, pest protection, good fencing takes care of that. The soil is another important consideration. I'm going to now go in a little bit more detail about each of these: the water, sun, and soil. So with the water, easy access is important. When you are doing the watering itself, don't spray on the plants. It's better, if possible, to have the water be applied directly at the roots. Don't use hot water. You might think that's a funny thing to say, but if you've got black hoses in there out in a full sun for a period of time, the water coming from that at first is going to be very hot. So use that water in another way, or put it in some kind of container and let it cool down. Don't spray that right on your little plants. And ideally, you might choose to have a soaker or dripper hose, or you can even take a PVC pipe and set a system of pipes up where you've drilled holes in the pipes to selectively water in spot. That reduces the amount of water used in the garden and saves time versus spraying by hand from a hose. Okay, another thing you can do, this is a friend of mine, Grant Baxter, at his townhouse. He's using this as a container and he actually was able to get this free from someone who, the business anyway, that no longer needed it. But you can look for containers that you can use as a rain barrel or a cistern to capture water from your rain gutters, and then that water can be used in your garden for the dry periods. So this is a win-win. It helps you with your gardening, and it also helps in terms of the runoff that comes with rain, so it improves the quality of our nearby streams if more people were to do this. It also, for those of us who are Latter-day Saints and have an interest in self-reliant living, provides you with a basis of foods or water storage for your family if your regular water system goes out. Though, of course, it would have to be filtered and cleaned prior to use. So let's talk a little bit more in more detail about sun. Most vegetables need at least 6 hours of full sun, and a southern exposure is ideal. None grow well in complete shade, but there are a number. If all you have is an area that is partial shade, you can still have a vegetable garden. There are many crops that do like less sun. Any of the greens, like leaf lettuce, arugula, spinach, kale, they like the cooler weather of a somewhat shady area, though they need some sun. Broccoli, cauliflower, peas, beans, beets, Swiss chard, Brussels sprouts, these will all grow well with, instead of full sun, part sun will work. Talking about the soil, one thing that's important is the pH of your soil. Most of our soils are going to be slightly acidic in this area, and that's fine. Vegetable gardens grow best in the neutral range from 6.2 to 7.3. Another aspect of the soil are what nutrients are in the soil, and then of course the texture. Is it sandy? Is it clay? Is it a nice loam? A loam would be something that's friable. That means, you know, like if it's wet and you squeeze it tight, you let go, it falls apart. Clay will stay. You could make a ball out of the clay, and if that's the case, your soil, when it's wet, you squeeze it, it makes a tight ball. Then that is a sign you're going to need to add quite a bit of organic material to your soil. And one thing that's interesting that you might not be aware of is the uptake of nutrients that are in the soil. This chart shows a number of the different nutrients that are required for plant growth: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and so on. These are taken up best in that neutral pH range. And so You don't necessarily have to do a soil test, but certainly if you were growing plants and found that you were having difficulty, that they were not thriving, you might do a soil test to see if you had a pH problem. And then there are a few crops like blueberries that specifically want not a neutral pH. In the case of blueberries, they want to have an acidic or low pH. So you may have to amend the soil to create a lower pH. Another aspect of soil is to make sure there's adequate organic matter. In the top 8 inches of the soil, that's where most of the roots are going to be. You'd like to see about a quarter of that be organic matter, like composted leaves or compost from farm animals, horses, cows, as long as it's been well aged. You do not want to use fresh manure. That would not be good in the garden. There are 2 problems according to the USDA. It, of course, could burn the plant roots, but also the fresh compost or fresh manure contains pathogens. So it needs to be composted and aged before it's applied to a vegetable garden, at least. And when you're putting compost down, you shouldn't do it close to harvest time. If you're going to be, the crops will be in contact with the soil, it should not be any closer than 120 days before harvesting. And of course, you would prefer compost that does not have herbicide residues, because that herbicide then can sometimes kill your good plants or slow their ability to grow. And a lot more information about soils and everything that you might need to know about vegetable or fruit gardening is available at the University of Maryland Extension website that it focuses on this, the Grow It, Eat It program. And this is their address, growit.umd.edu. A little bit more about compost. These are photos of, again, my friend Grant Baxter, who has a townhouse and makes such good use of it that he is able to grow on his very, very small space more food than we grow on our 2 acres, which shows you a lot of it has to do with how you approach the gardening, and that you can do intensive gardening. And one of the things he does is he has a very good system for composting. He has 3 bins, one for fresh materials, the food items from his kitchen, food scraps, not meat, but things like eggshells, fruit and vegetable matter. Then, in addition to that, he adds leaves and grass clippings, branches, dead perennials. You could add newspaper, not the colored ads, but just the print, and cardboard, especially if you tear it up. All of that together, with a little bit of moisture and time, breaks down and makes this wonderful organic compost that can be applied in your soil or to the surface for your vegetable garden. Doesn't that, I mean, if you know anything about compost, you'll look at that picture on the bottom right and with Grant's hand in it and think, wow, that is beautiful compost to have. This is his son who's spraying water on it. Kids can have a lot of fun helping out with vegetable gardening. Keeping it moist, every once a month or so, spraying it with water if it's been a dry period will help it decompose faster, as well as having good airflow, as you see here from the holes in the boards and the plastic edging. And then it takes some work to do it, but in Grant's case, he removes those boards in the front and periodically turns it over. That will really accelerate the speed with which the items break down. I'm kind of a lazy gardener, so with our compost piles, we just pile things up, and I let the rain be the water, and it decomposes, but just takes a little bit longer, but I don't turn. So it just depends on the speed with which you want to get compost. Now, when it comes to preparing the garden bed, if you've got an area that's currently just sod, lawn, one approach is to dig it. You can turn the soil over using a spade or shovel, breaking up the sod, pulling out weeds, and then you can leave the grass in place. It will decompose. and add to this top surface good compost and leaf grow or aged leaves, and you'll have an excellent site for planting. Another approach, which is the way I like to do it because it's less work, is what's known as no-till or lasagna gardening. You cover the turf area with newspaper or cardboard and overlapping the pieces so there's no sunlight to reach the grass underneath, and they need to be overlapped at least 5 or 6 inches to be successful at this, in my experience. And I like using even larger pieces of cardboard than what is in this picture, as large as I can find, because then you have fewer cracks. Then on top of that, you add about 4 inches of compost, shredded leaves, or leaf grow. And ideally, you do this in the fall, and then your garden would be ready to grow in the spring. Since we're doing this talk in March, it's not too late. You could still do it, but what you'll find is the plants that are sort of shallow-rooted, like the lettuces, spinach, you can plant those in this spring, early time period. They'll grow fine, and by the time you hit May, if you were to do this now in the beginning of March, by the time you hit May, most of that cardboard would have started to degrade and decompose, and as would the plant material underneath it. And so you could just dig in little individual holes for the plants that you would put out in the late spring, May to June time frame. The things like your tomatoes and peppers. Now, your very first year, you might not be very successful trying to grow things like carrots or beets that need a looser soil base for their root to grow in. But still, it's a low effort way to get a vegetable garden started, and by the following year, you'd have this amazingly soft, easy to dig in soil where the sod has decomposed, and then it makes it just a nice layer that's got a fairly high organic level to it. This is a picture to show you how to if you're using newspaper, that you need to overlap it. And nowadays our newspapers aren't as thick as they used to be, so you need, it ought to be at least 8 or 10 pages worth of paper. It can't just be 1 or 2 pieces that's not strong enough to suppress the grass. All right, another approach is to build a raised bed, and there are some advantages to that. You can have greater yields. The quality of your soil might be better, especially if what you've got in your own property is problematic, because in a raised bed, typically you'll fill it with a mix of, say, topsoil and leaf grow, and you build a nice soil. It warms up faster in the spring, so you can plant out a little bit earlier. It drains well. It's a little bit easier. You don't have to bend down as far, so as when you're both weeding and planting and picking, it's a little easier on your back. The root area seems to grow better because there's less compaction of the soil, and you don't have as much erosion because the moisture is held in by the box sides. Now, there are some disadvantages. There's the upfront labor of building the boxes and the expense. They dry out much faster, and they're relatively permanent when they're framed. So you can get some of the advantages. Sort of a hybrid is you can take, as this picture right above my head here, you can make a simple mound where you build some organic matter into the soil and build it up so that it's raised above the area around it, and it's loose, friable, good soil. You'll get the benefits of the raised bed, but it won't dry out as fast. It won't need to be watered as often, and it's cheaper. You don't have to buy and build the sites. So it's just up to you what you want to do. Here's a picture kind of contrasting 2 gardens. The one on the left is a garden of a friend, and it's very lovely with raised beds and a nice stone or brick set path. But that would take a fair amount of money to build a garden like that. And on the right-hand side is our simpler approach, which is just amended soil. And I use 1 foot square stones that I set around where I need them to access, where I'm going to be stepping on a regular basis to access the plants. And I can adjust where those stones are year to year depending on what I'm planting. You do want to have, it's helpful to have either a path or stepping stones to avoid compacting your soil. You want to minimize the amount of walking you're doing on the soil, as that compression constrains the roots, and it also limits oxygen and water flow in the soil. And once soil is compressed, it takes quite a lot of time for the various creatures in that soil and time for it to decompress. I mean, it can be years. So that's something especially important in terms of, like, if you've got heavy equipment, why you would want to avoid using that in a garden setting. Now, the real fun starts when you're choosing which plants you're going to grow in your garden. The University of Maryland Extension Grow It, Eat It program has a lot of information recommending particular cultivars that grow well in our area. This would be also useful for people anywhere in the Mid-Atlantic could use this as a source. But if you're not in this area, just turn to your own local extension for advice. But some basic principles when you're choosing vegetables and fruit to plant is choose things you like to eat. I do often plant things like radishes and turnips because they're easy to grow, but I don't actually much like eating them. So you wouldn't want to put a large area of your garden in plants that you're not yourself going to enjoy eating. It's helpful to choose the plants that are highly nutritious, that are relatively expensive to buy, that are easy to grow, that taste best fresh. Things like tomatoes, there's just no comparison. A store-bought tomato is never as good as a garden tomato. Just simply doesn't happen. The flavors are not at all, flavors, texture, moisture, not the same. And then, of course, plants that will be of a size that will fit in the space and sun exposure that you have. And for some, there are diseases that you would want to avoid, and so to be aware of that. And you can learn that by Googling when you're planning your garden. It's a good idea just to do a little Google search on the various plants that you're planning to do. So let's talk about tomatoes, because I bet everybody's going to grow tomatoes. Of course, tomatoes like full sun, and they usually need some kind of staking or cage. I mean, you don't have to do that. They can grow on the ground, but they'll be more productive if you allow them to have an upright structure. There are certain problems that sometimes happen with tomatoes. So when you're choosing cultivars, you might look for the markings of a V, F, or N. That would indicate they're verticillium, wilt, fusarium, and nematode resistant. You can save your own seeds or buy seeds. And there's a great variety in terms of what you can grow. And this is another advantage of having a home garden, is the range of what you can experience when you grow. So for example, and this is just a small sample of the different colors. The upper right is a tomato that's mature and ready to pick when it's orange rather than red. On the lower right, those are some just that I picked in my garden, and you can see I've got a few of the purple Cherokee tomatoes, delicious in a nice dark purple. Some of my favorites, I don't have it in the picture, are there's a little yellow tomato that is, let's see, yeah, about this size, shaped like a light bulb. Lovely, it's very tasty. And so choose a variety of tomatoes. I usually have will grow some that are the big, what they call beefsteak tomatoes. They'll grow very large, nice to have cut, say like, or I also grow some mid-size because they tend to produce well. And then the little cherry type tomatoes are so much fun to pick and eat just straight from the vine or in salads. So if you only have space for, say, 3 or 4 plants, I would suggest not making them all the same, but to try one each of a variety of tomatoes. Let's talk a little bit about seed types, just so you're familiar with some of the terms you'll encounter. An heirloom or heritage seed is a plant that's been grown for many years by gardeners, and the seeds have been saved and shared. And typically, they've been around in gardens for more than 75 years. Then open pollinated seed, that refers to seeds that's been saved from a plant that's been growing in an area where it's somewhat controlled. And so, for example, if you're growing a particular type of squash, then only those squash are being grown in that area. So it's open pollinated, but from plants where they're growing together with other plants of the same variety. Then you can have cross-pollinated seeds. That's where you've got the plant grown in an area where there's a variety of plants. And so the results in terms of the genetics of the next generation may be random because there's been cross-pollination between different plants. Then there are hybrids. Those are seeds that have genetic background where plant breeders have specifically in a controlled way mixed the genetics for specific traits like taste, disease resistance. And then genetically modified seeds are those in which the DNA has been altered by injecting some of the DNA from an additional organism that would not have occurred naturally. And these seeds would be patented. Okay, so that helps you when you're selecting your seeds to know some of those terms. Now, the basic thing when it comes to planting your crops is simply to follow directions. Either the directions that'll be on the seed packet, or if you buy the plant as a plant, the tag that comes with the plant, or if you don't have those kind of directions, you can always Google what you're planting and follow those directions. Because there's a wide variety of conditions in which each of these different plants needs to grow. Not only how much sun it needs, the time that you plant, whether you plant it as a direct sow, that means you're planting directly the seeds into the soil, or whether it's something you plant in a pot and grow inside 4 to 6 or 8 or 12 weeks in advance of your last frost date. Then there's the variation in terms of spacing for the seeds. So there's a lot to know about each plant that it's best just to read up about each one before you plant, and then you'll have a healthier garden and more productive garden. How deep you plant the seeds also varies, and typically a small seed, like a lettuce seed, which you can barely see, that's going to be maybe just sprinkled on the top of the soil or raked in just barely, whereas something that's larger, like a squash seed, will be planted a little bit deeper. Again, just follow the directions and you'll do fine. When it comes to buying seeds, you can sometimes save money by buying in larger amounts and then saving the seed from season to season, but your germination rate tends to drop a little bit with each year. One thing I found helpful is I'll seal up the container that if once it's been opened, I seal it after I've used what I want, and then I keep the seeds in the crisper drawer of the refrigerator where it's cool but it's not going to freeze. And that seems to work pretty well, and I've had success keeping seeds and using them for several years. You can swap seeds with friends. That's a great, friends, neighbors. It's a great way to save costs and have greater variety. I have a neighbor across the street. She and I share seeds every year, so we each have a broader variety to plant. And you can save seeds from many plants, and again, this is something you can learn more about online to process because it varies for different plants. And then you can also get seeds from groups that do seed saving, like seedsavers.org. And that's a good thing to do because One of the things about growing your own food is in today's world, we actually are now down to, I believe at last count, there are only 10 companies worldwide that are the major providers of seed for the whole world. And the amount of diversity that we have access to, genetic diversity for our food crops, has really diminished. Because in the days of my grandmother, for example, most people didn't get their seeds buying them. They got them by swapping, and there was a lot of variety, even just local in a single community like Vernal, Utah, varieties that would be grown among the neighbors that were different that you'd find there than what you'd find somewhere else. And the same could be said for every community where there were gardeners. And now, if you have only 10 companies and they have a relatively small range of plant seeds that they offer, and those are genetically identical year to year and place to place, many people have concern about the loss of genetic diversity. So one thing you can do is to grow heirloom seeds and save them and swap them with other gardeners. Okay, when you're buying plants that are already grown, one thing you'll want to do when you're looking at these plants is to choose seedlings that are have a good healthy root system but are not root bound. And you know, there is no problem when you're in a nursery to just tipping the little frame and pulling the plant out and looking, and because you can just slide it back in to the container, and you should see that it has a healthy root system, but it's not like a tight mat of roots. That would be the ideal. Then hardening off, what does that mean? That means a lot of these plants have been grown in controlled conditions in a greenhouse where they've had a pretty steady state of temperature, and they've also not had wind to deal with. And if you take these pampered plants and put them straight out in the harsh world, a lot of times they have trouble. So hardening off is the process of bringing the plants outside for a number of hours each day. Maybe you set them out for 3 or 4 hours a day for, say, a week. And by then they've gotten accustomed to the changing temperatures and having to move with wind, and then you can plant them out into the garden. And then wait until, in our area, early May to transplant out the tender, heat-loving plants like tomatoes, peppers, and so on. So there are the crops, the early crops that can go directly in March. You can start planting with seeds directly into the garden. And then there are the other plants, peppers, tomatoes, eggplant are some examples that have to wait until it's warmer. Sweet potatoes are another one. Another early is you can plant your, usually in our area by St. Patrick's Day. So next week we could plant our in-ground regular potatoes. But sweet potatoes have to wait. They're more tropical plants, so they have to wait until after our last frost date. What I usually do is look at the weather, the 10-day forecast in the first part of May. And if the first part of May you've got 10, say on May 3rd or 4th, and you look at 10 days out, which would put you to the 14th, and there's nothing close to freezing temperatures, then you can plant out. Okay, so we've been talking about spacing of plants. Here's a couple of photos to show. This is spacing of tomatoes in a garden. And even though in the first picture on the left, it looks like there's plenty of space. What you see as they're growing out, that's as tight as you'd want to do tomatoes. And in fact, you probably would be better off with a little more space between them. So again, follow directions, and you want to give enough space so that the plants thrive, but not too much space, because then you end up having problems with weeds in the open soil between your plants. There's also an aspect of time in the garden and something called succession planting. So you have plants that you will grow very well in the early springtime, like the lettuces, which the light green curly-leafed plant is here on the left. But those don't do well in the hot summer sun. They'll die back. So they're a good companion plant, so you can start those in the spring, harvest, and by the time your tomato plants are nice and big and needing the space, the lettuce is kind of dying back. So throughout the season, your garden will continually change and be producing different foods. And in the fall, you can plant again cool weather crops that will take you into the winter. There are even some plants that are able to grow here in our climate throughout the winter if it's not a really harsh winter. And it's beyond the scope of this talk, but you can use, there are techniques to be able to grow crops even through the winter with some protection. So some very specific plants that love the cool weather of spring and fall: the leafy greens, the brassicas, that's broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, collards, the root vegetables like beets, carrots, turnips, parsnips, they all thrive in cool weather. Peas are another plant that like the cool weather. So for example, I was out this morning planting peas in our garden. It's March, I think it's March 11th today. So early spring you can plant these types of crops. Another thing is crop rotation. The basic rule here is that you never plant the same crop in the same spot year to year if you can avoid it. And this principle is based on two things. One is each plant pulls different nutrients out of the soil. So by rotating the crops, there are some plants that really pull a lot of nutrients out of the soil. Then there are other crops that actually, like the legumes, the peas and beans, are actually useful for putting nutrients into the soil. So there's the aspect of nutrients. Then the second thing is for pest control. If you grow the same crop in the same area for an extended period of time, you often have a buildup of the pests that are attracted to that particular crop. Whereas when you're rotating crops, this is less likely to happen. So just some basic rules: that you plant the heavy feeders after the legumes. You rotate the root crops. You'd plant them before, because they pull a lot of nutrients. You use them and then follow them with the legumes. Plants like squash, cucumbers, and melons can go before any crop because they're not heavy feeders, and they also don't put nutrients back. You've got an idea is to keep the taller crops on the north side of your garden so that as they grow, they don't shade the other plants. So it's helpful as you're planning your garden, and it's a good idea to do this, to just make a simple pencil sketch of the space you have and what you're planning to plant. And then, because it's surprising sometimes, at least if you have a memory like mine, you can't remember where you've planted what. And especially when the plants haven't yet come up, or they're just very small, they're harder to tell apart. As they get larger, it's usually easy to tell. But anyway, it's helpful to keep a little drawing, and then you can track year to year what you've planted where. And then companions. There are some great companion plants to put together in the garden. And also, I happen to be lucky to have a good companion. This is my husband, Jeff Smith, sitting in the garden to do some weeding. I'm going to talk first about the cilantro. That happens to be the plant that's little white blooms blooming right above Jeff's head. I love cilantro. It's nice to pick and use fresh in a lot of different recipes. And it grows. It will, if you let it self-seed, it will grow up during the winter, at least in our climate. So you can even harvest very early, like now in early March, I could harvest cilantro. But then if you want, you can let it go to seed, and I like doing that because the flowers are very pretty, and then you have seeds to plant out in other parts of your garden. And this is also a plant that doesn't necessarily have to grow in a fenced area. And it's also true of other herbs that have strong scent. Sometimes you can grow them outside your fencing and the deer and other animals leave them alone because of the scent. Anyway, cilantro is an example of a plant that repels aphids. Helps keep your garden from having aphids, as French marigolds are useful for repelling nematodes, insects, and small animals. Plants like parsley and carrots, they repel flies, and it turns out they're also very attractive to certain caterpillars that have beautiful butterflies, so I like having them in the garden. And then there are some plants that are vegetables that grow well together, like the traditional three sisters that the Native Americans planted together: corn, beans, and squash. And now some of the unpleasant aspects of gardening, the weeds. Okay, so these are some common weeds in our area. Generally speaking, in a vegetable garden, it's best to pull the weeds or hoe them rather than using an herbicide. And some people feel like it's best to just cut the weeds right at the base where they're emerging from the soil, and not disturbing the soil by pulling up the whole plant. Now, on the downside of that is that the weed will grow back, and you'll have to keep doing this. The positive thing is that you're not disturbing the soil, and therefore other weeds won't grow in the area. Leave that to you. It's a choice. Another thing you can do to help reduce the amount of weeds you have is you fill the area with good plants. That helps reduce weeds. You can use newspaper or straw, compost, or mulch to cover the area that's not planted. And in the fall, plant cover crops to protect the soil over the winter and keep the cool weather weeds like chickweed and bittercress from growing. And then the cover crop can be cut down or dug in and provides nutrients for the next year's crops. Pest in our area, well, it's an animal that's in itself not a pest, but because we have so many of them, like I've counted 50 at a time in our garden, they can really decimate a vegetable garden in short order if it's not fenced. So we put up a fence around our garden. It usually requires an 8-foot fence, or you can do a shorter double fencing. They don't like to jump into a small area, or electric fencing. Any of those options work. In general, one thing that's nice is if you have a variety of plants in your garden, not just the vegetable garden, but the broader garden, you really don't need to use pesticides much, because you'll have a good mix of very diverse insect life and animals that help keep each other in control. So for example, on the far right side here, this is a particular worm that likes to, caterpillar, excuse me, that is detrimental to tomato plants. This was in my garden. But these little white sacs on its back, those are parasitized. It's been parasitized by a wasp that's laid its eggs here on it, and when those eggs hatch, the larva will eat from that caterpillar, killing it. And so I don't have to do any control for that in my garden. It will not be able to kill my tomatoes because it will die. So there can be this nice web of life that happens and reduces your use of any kind of pesticides and herbicides. And you also end up having, again, especially if you've got a variety of other plants in your garden, and native plants in particular, you can have things in your garden like frogs and toads, turtles, beautiful butterflies, birds. It's our own properties become little miniature wildlife refuge. So it's good to do what we can to protect insects and other life forms. This sunflower photo on the left, I took the picture only being aware of the large native bumblebee, but then once I looked at it more closely, there were 5 other pollinators present. So diverse life, if we let it, we can nurture life through our gardening. thought you might like this quote from Brigham Young. And this is quite amazing to me when you think that back in his day, really the lives of families depended on the success of their crops. And for most of us, we enjoy what we grow, but we're not going to starve without it. We do have local grocery stores we could turn to. And not so for the early church members as they were growing their crops. But he said regarding grasshoppers, according to present appearances, we may expect grasshoppers to eat nearly all our crops. But if we have provisions enough to last us another year, we can say to the grasshoppers, these creatures of God, you are welcome. I've never yet had a feeling to drive them from one plant in my garden, but I look upon them as the armies of the Lord. So respecting each creature as having been created by God and having a role in the web of life is a good way to approach gardening. Though I don't know that I could say I'm as good as Brigham Young in this case, but something to aim for. In the meantime, when you have a bug, it's helpful to know the insects in your garden. And the so-called bad bugs, which of course are not inherently bad, it's just that to us we view them as harmful. It's helpful to know their life cycles, and in most cases you can, if you have an excess abundance of a particular insect, can manually remove them in a way that doesn't harm other insects or other life forms and allows your plants to remain intact. So for example, with Japanese beetles, I'll just go around with a glass or milk jug and gather them up in a jar and dispose of them. We have some invasive bugs like the Japanese beetle here, or the brown marmorated stink bug, which is problematic in some food crops. The top photos are of the harlequin bug. It is also a pest it loves the brassicas, for example. So it's helpful to know what they are and to remove them, because in many cases an individual insect might lay, say, 500 eggs. So the way I look about it is if you can physically remove what you see, you may not get everyone, but you can get enough to keep the populations from getting out of hand and decimating your garden. You're not doing any harm to the other creatures that are living as you would be if you were using chemicals. So that's one way to approach it. Another thing is protecting the good insects that surround us. There are so many that do a great deal of good in our gardens. And these photos are all from my garden. Let's get creative in where we plant vegetables. It's possible, for example, in our area, any new tree has to be protected with, I use usually metal stakes and a wire frame circle around the trees. You can plant beans or peas and grow them up along that, and they happen to be plants that are nitrogen fixing, so they're providing nitrogen to the roots of the tree, and then you eat them in season, then it'll die back, and you can use the pea plant material to break it up and make a nice mulch for the plants, protecting the tree roots and holding moisture in place. This is an example where I've just taken twigs and you can just stick them in wherever you want in your garden, and it can be even in like where you would later in the year have flowers, and let things like the early peas grow. Another thing, if you want to expand areas where you are planting your edible vegetables and fruits, is you can mix herbs and vegetables within a flower bed. But and in this photo you see cosmos, the flowers at the top, there's some spinach growing, some strawberry. But you want to be very careful not to use any sprays, herbicides or pesticides in the area. Also, if you're mixing plants together, it's important to have done a little bit of research on the plants, the non-vegetable plants, to make sure they're not toxic. Because there are some of our ornamental plants that are highly toxic, and you certainly don't want to inadvertently pick some of them along with your vegetables. Here's my mom pulling beets, and so my parents have a very small yard of about a quarter acre, but it's very productive, and they mix their flowers and vegetables together. So you've got tomatoes and cucumbers and beets and herbs like sage and rosemary and thyme, all mixed in with flowers, and so it's pretty, it's colorful, and it's productive. And also in that relatively small yard, they grow a lot of fruit, enough they have enough to feed themselves, often share with neighbors, and can. So they've got raspberries, pear, peaches, apple, cherry, apricots. When I was growing up, they had all those types of trees and plums, and produced a lot of food for the family and for the neighbors. It's amazing. Oh, grapes too. They had three different types of grapes. Eating grapes, juicing grapes, and grapes they make into raisins. And amazing, again, for a relatively small lot that they produce a lot of food. And I think I already had this photo on one of the other slides, but I love how this is something I did, how just by the simple task of using a stick and drawing in wavy lines instead of planting in a straight row, you can make your vegetables actually become part of the decorative aspect of your garden. And so they can both be attractive and provide food for you. And you can, even here's you've got a variety of flowering plants that are going to fill in this space later in the year, but potatoes you can plant early, like mid-March, and then you harvest them in the early summer. So you can grow those in between other plants if you don't have enough space in your vegetable garden. Another trick, if you have very little space, this is like a stairwell to a basement on a property where they didn't have any gardening space at all, and they used that stairwell with containers, and in this case a bag that they filled with soil and then planted potatoes into, and get a crop of potatoes every year out of the bag. There are techniques for doing upside down growing of your tomatoes, where if all you have is a space where you can hang pots, you can have your tomatoes growing in that way. You can have self-watering containers so that if you're doing a lot of your vegetables in containers, that it doesn't require as much watering. Larger containers are better in terms of holding keeping the soil moist and having enough space for the roots. There are vertical container wall systems. There's all kinds of varieties of ways that you can creatively make space to do a garden if this is what you want to do. You don't need a large yard. Another thing is straw bale gardens. You can even do this on like a driveway parking area, and that's you put a number of straw bales, not hay, but straw, in a line, and then you some master gardener friends who did this said it's best to put some compost along the top, or something like leaf grow along the top of the straw bales, then plant into that, and gradually over the growing season the straw bale kind of decays down a little bit and the roots stretch out into it. You keep it moist, and then you can at the end of the season just use that straw to recycle into your garden bed for the next year. Or so that's an idea, can be used in on sod that you don't want to have to dig out, or on even something like concrete. You can create a garden there. Back to my friend Grant Baxter. I'm just going to quickly show some photos of his garden. And think of how much he produces here in his relatively small townhouse space. He uses a vertical. He lets the squash and things grow up along this wall and along the railing of his deck. In the front, instead of having just a little small area of lawn, he's replaced that, and it's got blueberries underplanted with strawberries. They're beautiful in the spring with their blooms, in the summer providing fruit, in the fall the leaf color of the blueberries is gorgeous. So it's really lovely and it's productive. And this is the backyard, and it's extremely productive because they're raised beds and he's using all the vertical space. He's got grapevines that grow up, providing shade for their patio and food for the family. He does something called guerrilla gardening, where with the consent of his neighbors, some of his plants even exceed the edge and go out into some public space. And that's an area where he's also planted raspberries that the neighborhood children can come to and enjoy. And you know, those raspberries, the picture is actually one that I took of my parents' raspberries. Doesn't that look delicious? I like to grow some of the food plants that come back year to year as perennials. An example of that is asparagus, because once you plant it, although you do have to be patient, the first few years you don't harvest, but after that, every single year they come back and you have delicious asparagus that you just snap off. In fact, I eat a lot of it in the garden because it is so tasty. I mean, just fresh, picked, raw asparagus is incredible. Anyway, and in the next few weeks we get a little bit of rain, I'll walk out and our garden will have asparagus spears to eat. Rhubarb is another great choice that's a perennial, so once you plant it, it comes back year to year. And what I like about it is it's deer resistant because the leaves are poisonous, but the stems, of course, we eat. They're great in pies, for example, cut up. And it's a plant that likes full sun, so you do not have to plant this inside a fenced area because no animal will bother it. There are many different types of fruits we can grow in our area. Apples, cherries, peaches, pears, plums, pawpaw, great choice because that's a native plant to our area. Figs are not particularly cold hardy, so you want to protect those from cold. Plant one of the varieties that's more cold resistant than others. Blueberries are native to our area. As I mentioned earlier, they like to have acidic soil. Grapes, hardy kiwi, rhubarb, raspberries, strawberries, blackberries, currants, elderberry. There are many, many options. These are some peach trees in our garden, and aren't they pretty in the spring? I think they're worth growing just for their blooms. And blueberries, also lovely, delicious, pretty easy to grow if you give them the right sun conditions. And again, I like to mix some flowers in my garden, so they have a mix of beauty and functionality with the blueberries. With your fruit trees, if you don't have a lot of space, you can, they actually bear earlier and more heavily when they're cut back. And you'll need to study up on this because each different type of fruit tree has different conditions and time periods at which you do the pruning. But for example, here with this pear tree growing up against a wall, they've got a productive pear tree in a very small space. Finally, if you have additional questions, you want to learn more, I highly recommend the Grow It, Eat It program that the University of Maryland Extension has created. It's got every type of information you could ever need about growing fruits and vegetables in our area. They also sponsor, the Master Gardeners sponsor free classes in growing vegetables. And at this website you can get information on that. The Master Gardeners also have a demo garden in Durwood that you could visit and get ideas. So congratulations on your journey of food gardening. I wish you well and hope you enjoy it very much as we have done. Thank you.